are back in the shop for another round of the PTV build. We are going to continue on with the chassis today. Hopefully we can get everything sorted out, including the track mounting, the final mounting for the controls. I want to get as much done as possible. I really am looking forward to getting this unit out and giving it a test drive. I think I might even do that before we get a coat of paint on it, just to see how well it does. But like I said, I'm really looking forward to getting this up and running, so let's just get right to it. This rod that originally connected the track undercarriage, the track suspension, to the snowmobile tunnel, this is a 1.1 inch outside diameter rod. So I'd picked up from my local metal shop a piece of cold rolled round bar that's 1 1/8, so it's 25 thousandths more than what we have here. And the problem is that 25 thousandths makes all the difference in it fitting into that hole. So what we need to do is get that piece of 1 1/8 inch rod mounted into the lathe, and we need to turn down the outside diameter of that shaft by about 25 thousandths, and that shouldn't be a problem. I have figured out how we're going to do that. Even though it's a 10 by 22 lathe, we can use the end support and let that rod extend way out past the lathe and get the section that we need machined into place. So we'll do a couple quick little measurements here to make sure that we get this width correct, the spacing from the outside of the frame rail into that tube, and then the length of that tube. Then we should be able to get that piece of round bar machined and continue on. So we are out in the shed. This is my 10 by 22 lathe, and what I've done, I have removed the tailstock out of it, and I've put this support in here, and that's what basically lets us run this whole 5-foot long chunk of cold rolled rod in the lathe. I was doing a little bit of testing. I wanted to make sure this is going to work out before I got too far along, and yes, it does work well. Basically all you need to do is we set up the dial indicator onto the carriage, make sure that the rod is actually centered the right distance from the tool. Once we've got that established, we can basically just run the tool back and forth and remove our 25 thou, so that this rod here, this section that I have that's already finished, is already 1.1 inches, and it's good to go for those tracks. This is that shaft that we turned down in the lathe. It turned out really nicely. There's just a little bit at the end there that I need to cut off. That's what was being grasped in the chuck of the lathe to turn it. But overall, so we've got this section turned down to 1.1 inches, and this other section here turned down to 1.1 inches. So this should fit, once I get those cut, those should fit beautifully into those tubes there. And then the next part is just to come up with a piece of tab, like a piece of flat with a hole drilled in it, and I want to have it just so it bolts to the chassis. I don't really want to commit to welding it in place yet. I want it to be maybe removable for now, and so yeah, we'll just grab something out of the scrap bin, maybe a piece of 1/4 inch flat bar, drill a hole out, get this put together, and then start working on the back. have the crossbar in place now. The tracks are both fully seated onto it, and there's a good amount of extra for us to work with on each side, so we can move the tracks in or out as required. I won't be cutting them off anytime soon, just because I want to make sure that the back suspension is all working out nicely, and we can make sure that that gap between the frame rail and the track is going to be good where it is, and then we can cut it off after. So the next step here is just to shuffle the chassis forward a little bit, just so that that front crossbar there is actually in line with the front of the tracks. And then I'll get the mounting bracket here clamped in place. We'll drill that. It gets bolted to the chassis, and it'll get welded to that 1 1/8" crossbar there. And that'll be done for now. And then we're going to move on to connecting the back of the PTV to the tracks. We've got this bracket just tacked in place onto the shaft. 2 3/8" bolts going through the frame rail, and it's got just a little bit of a gap underneath it there. And the reason I did that is the belly pan material is actually going to basically skin from one side to the other, and I want it to be continuous all the way underneath the this front axle here. So that's why it's spaced out. It turned out pretty good so far. Everything is working exactly how I wanted it to. So the next step now, get this flipped back over right way up and start to get the rear tracks in place and figure out how we're going to incorporate the suspension and the springs into that whole setup. Okay, so I've been doing a little bit of thinking as to how exactly I'm going to set up this rear end for suspension. Originally, what I was going to do was very crude. I was going to take the axle tube right there and extend it out just so that it stuck out to about here. And then all I was going to do is just land this shock on it and then have that attach up here. But the more I think about it, that would put a lot of, well, basically all of the alignment for the tracks to stay straight this way on that front axle. And so anytime the track is, or the weight of the machine is like coming down, that shock is going to be pushing that track out and kind of trying to tip it out like that. So all of that stress is going to be on that front axle, and I didn't like the way that that was going to play out. So I've come up with a little bit of a, I'll call it a swing arm idea. And so originally I was going to do this from the front, but I want to do it from the back here, just to try and increase the stance, the spacing between that front axle and the other contact point of the swing arm in relation to the track. And so it just kind of, rather than having all those points meet up at the middle there, it still puts a lot of stress on that front frame. So if we could spread that out to the back here, that'll help out a lot. So my plan is to take, this is just a piece of DOM tube, and this is a 1-inch bolt, and I've got just a 1-inch nylock on the end there. And I'm just going to take the end, the head of this bolt, and just kind of grind it down so that it will fit into this tube here, and basically it's going to stick out alongside the track. And then in this piece of rectangular tube here, we're going to use a hole saw to cut a hole into here, and that's where this piece of DOM tube is going to fit through and then get welded on both sides into place. We're gonna do a similar thing up here with a 3/4 inch hole. So it'll be 1 inch down there and it'll be 3/4 up here at the back. So we will get this spaced out in such a way that that we have this piece of tube almost, I'd say, centered in this gap here. So it's not centered right now. I just have a piece of 1/4 inch flat bar spacing it. So it'll be moved over a little bit more. And then what we'll be able to do at that point is land the shock onto that piece of that rectangular tubing, and then we're gonna land it somewhere up top there. I'm not sure exactly how we're gonna do that yet, but that's basically how it's going to land. And we're gonna rely on a little bit more of the rigidity of these, I call them intersecting points, these tubes here, to keep everything aligned. And so it'll, like I said, remove some of the stress from up there, bring it back to this contact point here. So this swing arm is basically going to only be able to swing in this direction. So any of this side to side movement should get taken up by this piece of DOM at the bottom and at the top here, and that should keep everything in a little bit better alignment. So that is what I'm going to start working on. I need to get a couple more measurements, and then we're gonna take these two pieces of tube, drill them out with the hole saw for the DOM. We're gonna work on the same arrangement with the piece of 3/4 inch DOM is what I'm thinking at the back end here. So we'll build that swing arm. We'll get these bolts into place, and then we got to get these little bolts welded into the tube inside of the track there. So I'm going to try and pull this out here, and then you can see a little bit better. So I have this piece that was in the track there a moment ago. I took it out. This is off of the old Snowcat. Actually, it was with these tracks on the old Snowcat. So we're going to take that piece of DOM with the 1 inch bolt. Once we get it fitted down, we're going to weld it into place there, and that will become our pivot for the back swing arm on the PTV. What I ended up doing is taking these pieces off of the old mini Snowcat, just putting them into the bandsaw and cutting them square so that they are nice and true in relation to the tube. When we cut them off the mini Snowcat, they were just done with the grinder, so that was very crude and it wasn't square at all. So I did that, and then what I did is I just took the edge of this bolt off with the bandsaw as well, and otherwise dimensionally these bolts fit inside of this tubing perfectly, so that's going to work out well. It's just going to take some weld inside of here, inside of there, to fill that in, to lock this bolt into place, and that'll become our attachment point for that swing arm. So the swing arm attachment is going to sit somewhere in there like that, and we're going to have our piece of DOM tube that's going to slide over the end there. And then what we're going to do is use a hole saw to cut a hole into this rectangular tube, this 3x1, and then basically this tube is going to fit over that piece of DOM somewhere like that. It's going to be a little bit offset, and that'll help us get this swing arm centered in that gap between the track and the frame rail, and give us enough clearance to sneak that shock absorber down through there. Okay, so what we ended up doing is using a hole saw to drill out just I think that's 1.25 inch hole in the end of the square tube, and then I had to clean up these pieces of DOM in the lathe just to take about 10 thou off so that they would actually fit in there. So that is basically done. What we'll do when we go to actually put this together is have that stick out a bit. We'll lay a bead of weld around each side there, and that'll be the track side of the swing arm. So it's going to come together kind of like this. So we have this piece more or less centered inside of this gap between the frame rail and the track right now. It will be offset just like this, and we're going to put a nylock on this side, so that'll keep everything in place. And basically this is just going to pivot like that, so that we don't need to worry about it's only going to pivot in that range of motion. It's not going to allow the track, well, very minimally it'll allow the track to move side to side, but for the most part it's going to limit that motion just to up and down, so that we don't have to worry about the tracks kicking out or anything. It'll put a little bit of stress on the frame, but that'll be fine. That's the whole point here. So the next step is to take another piece of DOM, but one with a 3/4 inch inside diameter, and drill out this piece of rectangular tube just like we did with the 1 inch, and we will offset everything exactly the same way we did here. So we'll have a little bit more of the gap on the frame side at the pivot point on the chassis, and then that'll give us it'll give us somewhere to mount our shock, and then that'll basically be all there is to getting this back track connected to the chassis. Well, we're back in the garage for another night of working on the PTV chassis. Last night where we ended, I had mentioned I was considering the swing arm attachment point right at the back there. But that's not going to work. I did take a little bit of time to mock this up in CAD just to see how the different suspension components would interact. And basically, from the front axle there to the back attachment point of the track, it's 32 inches. So that's like a 32-inch radius, and that it would make an entire circle all the way around. And then if you imagine our shorter swing arm, its radius is only 14 inches, so it makes a much smaller circle. If we can get them to align just right, basically where those two circles touch at the midpoint of the suspension travel, there's very little deviation between the large circle and the small circle. So that's where we want to kind of nail our sweet spot. As the suspension rises or falls, 3 inches of rise or 3 inches of fall, the deviation between those two circles just begins to open up. And I figured that if we had it done just right, that 14-inch swing arm, by the time it gets to the top or the bottom of that rotation, that 3-inch travel, we're only going to be out by about a 1/16 of an inch, which is, I would say, tolerable. It's going to put a little bit of stress on these components, but I don't think it's going to be anything significant. I'd say anything more than 1/16 of an inch would probably start to become an issue, but we'll see how this works out. I am going to continue on with the build here of the swing arm. So we'll get a little axle stub kind of sticking out somewhere midpoint here. We'll get our swing arms cut to length, and we'll get our little pieces of DOM welded inside them, and then we can start to look at how to attach the shock absorber to that swing arm. And somewhere up here it's going to be a little bit ugly. I'm not sure how we are going to achieve that yet, but yeah, that's all coming up. Okay, let's take a look at what I have here for the attachment point for that swing arm. What I did is I took a couple of those 1-inch bolts. I turned the head off in the lathe there, so that basically this now is the inside diameter of the Sked 40 pipe. This pipe is 1.05 inches, so that's what I machined this down to, so it's a nice snug fit. So we will hammer this in, and then we'll do a bead of weld around, and that'll be the end of that. And so this tube with these brackets here, similar to what we have up front there, this tube is going to run underneath the chassis and get bolted into place. And then basically this will be the pivot point for the front of the swing arm. So the piece of DOM is just gonna rotate around that. So we need to get that in place, but before we can get that in place, we need to get the lower track attachments finished. So we'll have to weld those up, get them installed into the track, and then we can work forward with the swing arm to determine exactly where we need to attach this tube, then get that drilled, bolted in place, and we'll be done with this and we can move on to getting the shocks installed. Let's take a look at what we've got here. So our swing arms are welded, and we have that little shaft there with those 1-inch bolts welded in into place. So that's done, and yeah, it's turned out pretty good. I'm quite pleased with it. So we're gonna have plenty of room to get the shock down from the top of the side of the roll bar here down to the top of that swing arm. No issues there. Same thing over here. That's going to be great. And overall, I think the range of motion is going to be pretty good. And we got this pivot point as far back as we could. I wanted to try and keep that swing arm as long as possible. Ideally, it would all swing off of that front axle, because that would be the kind of the center radius for the radius of this whole thing, but we want to spread that out a little bit just so that we can get a little bit more stability. So this is going to stop these tracks from, not completely stop, but it'll limit the ability for these tracks to go back and forth. It'll just give another point of contact rather than just the one up front going through. It'll also connect here at the back, so it should help try and eliminate a lot of that side-to-side motion. And yeah, I think this is going to work out well. Give you a little demonstration of how this is working. It's kind of difficult to see, but as the track goes up, that pivots around the front, and I think we're in really good shape here. So this is going to work out really nice. So you can see from the back here, that works out nicely. The next step will be to get that little tab there drilled and bolted into place. Once we've got that drilled and bolted in, we will just lay some weld around it to hold that shaft in place, and that'll basically be how this suspension system articulates. And then once I've got that done, we'll move on to the shocks and get those mounted. There we go. That is not permanently welded, but tack welded into place there. Everything's lining up well. Overall, I like the width of the machine. That is looking pretty good. So no complaints there. Next step is to get those shocks set up so that we can get this machine supporting itself and we don't need jack stands anymore. So let's get going on that. Well, there we go. I had to ponder for a minute how I was gonna do this, but I just figured a piece of this 1-inch rod I drilled and tapped so I could put the cross bolt through there. And then I just had some of these scraps of triangular pieces kicking around, so I've got one on top. I want to get some underneath here, but I will wait till I get everything apart. Right now, the machine is actually sitting on the shocks, so it is, I would say, entirely self-supported. The jack stands up front there, they are loose. They are not actually holding anything there. So overall, the machine is holding its own weight now. It's in a really good situation. I'm really pleased with how this has come out. All these little bits and pieces always add up to a ton of time to figure out how to get all of this working and to cut and drill, tap, do all that stuff. So to be honest, for me to work on that front bar and just this rear suspension swing arm thing took the same amount of time for me to do all the other fabrication for the frame, for the chassis. So it's a lot of detailed work to get everything kind of working the way you want it. But it's working the way you want it now. It is looking really good. I'm very pleased with this, like I said. And really that is the major milestone for the chassis build. So I would say 99% have a rolling chassis now. All we have left to do is come up with a couple smaller things, some mounts for the controls, also the control cables on the engine and the pump mount over there. We need to get that set up. We will progress on to getting this whole chassis finish welded. That'll be a little bit of time to get that taken care of. I will get a piece of the tube to kind of just kick this corner of the bumper in here, and we'll be done with that. So overall, the fabrication is coming really well. As usual, I've got to stop here because we are out of time. The next video, we will be working on putting a lot of the parts together, getting this chassis finish welded, and then hopefully we can get this thing running and moving very soon. Having said that, thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I really appreciate everybody who checks out the videos. It means a lot to me. I'm putting a ton of time into this, and it's been really exciting lately. It's been a change having something to look forward to, and something to look forward to filming for you guys is a good motivator. So thanks again, and take care.